Okay, well, Kia Tasso, it's great to see you all here this evening. My name's David Parsons. I'm Research Director here at Academy EX, and I'll be doing the presentation tonight. And I've also got Lisa here, Lisa Whittington Slater, who's our Outreach Manager, and she'll just be saying a few words at the end, just about some of our programs, if you're not already familiar with them. Um, Without further ado, I will start presenting. I'm going to open with a karakia and then we'll begin with the content. Okay, let's make sure I've got sound on for later. We've got a couple of videos to play. Should be all right. Okay, so we'll begin with our karakia whakataki, and if you've done our sessions before or our courses, you'll probably be familiar with this karakia that was gifted to the Mind Lab a few years ago by one of our staff. Ko te kawa orunga, ko te kawa oraro, ko te kawa ora, ko te kawa ora. E rongo whakairehia ki runga, turatura o whiti whakamaua ki tina. Tina hui e, tai ki e. Okay, let's talk about. So, as you may know, if you're familiar with these sessions, we like to have this idea of we have let's talk about, and then try and find something that we think educators and other interested parties would like us to talk about. And over the last, couple of years, we've done several different things relating to AI because it's a bit of a hot topic in education. Um, so this is really, the next one in that series, I guess, and addressing something that I think is front of mind for a lot of educators, which is AI and authentic assessment. I've got a whakatoki. We often use a whakatoki to kind of set the scene for our Let's Talk About sessions and indeed our class sessions. Something that kind of captures the essence of what we want to say, really. So this is the one I've chosen for tonight. Whai a te mataranga hei auranga mō koto. Seek after learning for the sake of your well-being, or possibly in the case of AI and assessment, your sanity. Um, I think it's really important that we engage in learning as much as we can as educators about AI, the good, the bad, the ugly, whatever it might be, so that we can try to get on top of all of the very quick changes and the disruptive influences of these technologies that, of course, have, both positives and negatives. All right, so let's talk about my agenda. So, in a moment, I'm just going to ask you to share something around the impacts of AI on assessment. So, any of your own experiences. So, I'll be coming back to that shortly. I'm then going to start with a kind of a big picture view, the AI assessment landscape. There's a lot going on. So I'm just going to try and break it down into a couple of sort of areas of focus so that we can could you mute yourselves, please, if you
No, someone in meditation.
okay.
That corner.
Just trying to find where the noise is coming from.
It's a you coffee. Oh my.
It's okay, I've muted that now. Okay, apologies for that. Let's get going. Yeah, so what did I get to? Oh, yeah, the AI assessment landscape, just taking the big picture and then breaking it down into some areas of focus just to give us a handle on where we might start to discuss things. I'll look at some commonly discussed AI related assessment strategies, some of which you may have come across before. Um, I'll pick apart some of the big challenges we face. When it comes to the opportunities, I've got a sort of a wayfinding perspective, and I'll talk about that, about how we might navigate through those many opportunities of AI. And I think the sort of heart of what I'm going to talk about tonight is really how we might rethink assessment in the age of AI. And just at the end, I want to make a couple of comments around what's the role of AI literacy in perhaps reinforcing the learning aspect of giving assessments that include some kind of AI. Anyway, so that's my agenda. Before we get cracking, I just got this quote to sort of, I wanted to set the scene in a positive way. I know many of us are concerned about AI and assessment and the impacts that it has, but I did want to sort of start with a broad statement about AI and education in general from the World Economic Forum. It's an avenue through which students can improve digital literacy, critical thinking, problem solving, and creativity, preparing learners for future job demands. I just wanted to kind of start with something that, that was aspirational, because I do want to come back after we looked at some of the challenges at what the good potential is in having AI as part of the assessment process. Okay. So I'm going to ask you to participate now. This is a Slido. I always worry slightly whether Slidos are going to work, so I'm just going to check with my phone that that QR code works. So you can either use the QR code on the screen, or you can go to slido.com and you can just put that number in, and both of those will take you to the same poll. It's an open question poll, so you can write as much as you like, really. And the question is, what are your experiences of the impacts of AI on assessment, whether that's good or bad or indifferent? I'm got no agenda here. I'm just curious about what your experiences might be. I can see someone's typing already. That's excellent news, because that means it's working. I'll give you a minute or two to share your thoughts with that, given that it's quite a long answer question. Apologies for my bit of a cough I've got tonight. Okay, cool. That does seem to be working fine. So, and I can see we've got quite a few people typing, so they'll start to appear on the screen, and I'll start to talk through them in a minute as you get a chance to give your responses. Um, so my first response just says bad without further detail, which is a bit unfortunate, but hey. Okay, so others are sort of seeing a mix, good and bad. Yeah, I think that's a fairly common response, is yeah, there's good and bad. And it's good if if you're keen to see how you can use it, that's great. That's something I'll be trying to talk about. Cheating, yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, the can be, yeah, time consuming when you're chasing up about, misconduct. I totally see that. We get the same issues, lack of resources, lack of definitive tools. Yeah, well, yes, there are no tools that can detect it, really. We'll talk about that again later as well. Yeah, not to be frightened of. Yeah, I think that's the key thing. That we can be concerned, but there's no reason to sort of fear AI. I mean, you know, we're educators. We're used to tackling thorny problems. I can still see there's some more typing still going on, so I'll wait a little bit longer. Yeah, hallucination, generalizations. Yeah, there are definitely those major issues. Yeah, I mean, it makes stuff up and it writes boring stuff. Not Maybe that's a good thing. We can spot it. Um, depending on how we set our assessments, we can probably get around those problems. Yeah, definitely the AI literacy. I'm going to talk about that at the end a little bit. How do we help students to be better at using it? Of course, that's an important question, isn't it? A little bit more typing going on. Yeah, there is a lot of copy and paste, isn't there, without checking. Cool. Thank you so much for that. I will move on, but feel free to keep putting stuff in there if you want to share. I'm going to move on to the next slide now. So I mentioned I'm going to kind of start and look at the big picture landscape. Here's a figure that was created using AI, using Napkin. I'm sure some of you have used Napkin to make diagrams and figures. So the left-hand side of this at the top is, if you like, the big picture, which is challenges and opportunities. What can AI do for educators and learners as part of the assessment process? But that is quite big. So in order to try and pick it apart, the other three are ways I wanted to try and begin to tackle the question about what's the role of AI in assessment. So the bottom left side, AI for student use, I guess that's often the one that's front of mind. How can we guide students to select and apply AI tools effectively for assessment? I mean, assuming that we let them use AI, and of course that's another question to be considered, or whether AI is appropriate for certain students. But on the right, the other thing to consider is using AI ourselves in the assessment process. So the one at the top there, how AI can help educators to make better assessments. I think it certainly can. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And also, potentially, we can use it for grading and feedback. Of course, there are some ethical considerations. Transparency is important there, but I will talk about that too briefly in a moment before we start tackling the more thorny issues of student use. So those three things, like the two things that educators might use it for in assessment and the things that students might use it for, create a kind of a cycle, don't they? So if we think about where we start, so we might use AI to help us create and design assessment. The things I've got on the bullets are just, indicative. There are so many things that could come under all of these. But we might, for example, use it to help us suggest assessment tasks. We might align assessments to learning outcomes, um, you know, and build towards backward design. I'll talk about that in a moment. We might have multiple versions of assessment to make them more personalized. So there's lots of ways we could potentially use AI ourselves as educators to create better assessments. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then, of course, we give our assessments to students, and there's lots and lots of ways in which they might use it to assist the completion of those assessments. It might be brainstorming, it might be structuring their essays, it might be literature searches, it might be data analysis, it might be using AI to give them formative feedback against a rubric, for example. So there's lots of different options here where potentially the technology could be useful. And then, of course, the students finish their assessments, they hand them to us, and then we could perhaps use it for grading. We could use AI to make rubrics, we could use it to make marking schemes, we could use it for generating some detailed feedback. Hopefully, not just generating it without checking it, but we can do those things. So there's that cycle of AI for educators and then AI for students. Just to pick up on the creating assessments, I think there's some value here to think about. So we want assessments to be fair, valid, reliable, aligned with learning outcomes. And there's some well-known approaches that we probably should be following. One is constructive alignment, where we connect our assessments directly to clearly defined learning outcomes that we might have generated by AI, perhaps. Then the next step to the constructive alignment is backward design, where we have our outcomes, we develop the assessments, and then from that we develop the teaching strategies around the goals. And my experience of this is that, AI can provide some interesting ideas to bounce off. They're often kind of wrong or not very practical, but I do find that it's useful to have that kind of conversation with AI when I'm thinking about, well, what kind of classroom activities could I do if this is where I'm leading my students towards in terms of knowledge and understanding. And then there's the assessment for learning, the formative assessment role of AI. And I think it does have a powerful role to play here because students can, they can do some work, they can compare the work they've done against the assessment requirements and get some useful advice. And maybe that's when they can't get advice from their teachers. Maybe it's the weekend, maybe it's the middle of the night when there's no one to talk to. It could certainly be helpful there. And then there's other areas like, for example, inclusive culturally responsive assessment design, where we as educators can use AI to just critique our work. So Gen AI has got a lot of potential here, I think, in making the assessments that we write better. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down in the should we use AI for grading. There's a really interesting little passage in Justin Reich's book Failure to Disrupt, where he talks about Sidney Pressy's teaching machine back in the 1930s. And then when it was introduced in a US university, the student magazine was saying, well, what we'll do now is we'll develop our own machine to, put the work into the thing that automatically teachers, and then we can all go out and do something else. And of course, that's the vicious loop we don't want, where students create stuff with AI and then teachers grade it with AI, but there's no learning or anything going on. So we want to avoid that, of course. But some of you might be familiar with Brisk. It's just as one example of an AI tool that can help with giving students feedback. It's got a number of different features in it. The one that I think is quite interesting is the feedback one. You'll see there's a give feedback button here that relates to Google Docs. And if you go into that option, you can choose to do targeted feedback. Um, and targeted feedback will add comments to a Google Doc. You can do this with a rubric. In the example I've used on this screen, I just used a prompt. And what's nice about it is that, of course, it gives you a starting point to make comments on a piece of student work. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you would just, do that and then send it to the student. But you can edit them, you can delete them, you can add new ones, but you can build on what's been suggested by Brisk. But I would say that I think the key thing with this is if we use AI in our assessment, whether we use it to help us write the assessments or whether we use it to help us grade it, we should be transparent with the students about how we're using AI, because hopefully that will encourage them to be transparent about the way that they are using AI in their assessment work. So that's the couple of things from the teacher perspective. Before we move on, what I'd like you to respond to now is this very general question. This is a word cloud, so it's not a long answer question. So if you keep them as short as possible, maybe 1 or 2 words. If you could share what tasks you use AI for, and I don't mean work, I don't mean assessment, I mean just generally, like it can be in your work life, but also in your personal life. So if you can just share all of the ways that you currently use AI, that will be really interesting. And bearing in mind it's a word cloud, so if you see another one up there that's similar to what you want to say, it's great if you put exactly the same word or two in there so that the cloud sort of shows the most common ideas. Of course, you all understand a word cloud, I'm sure. I'll just pause for a moment while you share some ideas. I see we've got research already, transcribing. I'll just see what emerges over the next minute or two. Cool. I can see a few things emerging here. I can see lots of people typing, lots of things coming up here. So, quite a bit of this is kind of work related, but not all. We've got holiday, we've got hunting. Um, Itinerary. I'm not sure whether that's a holiday itinerary, but it could well be. Cool. Okay. It's interesting to see the range of things that people are using AI for. Obviously, research, travel, and idea generation at the moment came up most often, but there's lots of other ideas around the outside. Many of them are related to work in some way, but more in the sort of administration side of work, perhaps. Um, difficult letters, that's an interesting one. Transcribing, emails, generating case study. Yeah, really useful thing that, isn't it? Like it's nice to have a bit of help generating a case study for sure. Cool. Thanks for that. So I think one of the things that this brings out is that a lot of us are using AI for many things. If that's the case, it will be a bit strange if we were to try to say to students, you can't use AI at all, you know. So we're in that space where we really do have to think about, well, if we're using AI, and quite a few of you are using AI for work, you know, surely students should be allowed to use it as well. And that opens up all sorts of interesting conversations, doesn't it? So this is really the problem, I guess. So lots of educators are, of course, concerned that if students are using AI tools to do assessments, it's going to undermine the authenticity of those assessments. So that's the big problem, isn't it? And so what's emerging in a lot of the discussion is some kind of dichotomy, which is, well, do we only use secure invigilated assessments? Do we go back to, you know, writing by hand like the Victoria University law exam where the students have to write, you know, on pen and paper? Is that what we have to do? Um, or do we have to completely rethink what we mean by assessment and embrace AI? So is it a simple dichotomy? Are there other ways that we can think about this? And I'll look at some suggestions from other sources about how this might work. Um, Perhaps the most well-known one, and you may well have come across this before, is the two-lane approach that comes from the University of Sydney, where they've differentiated between assessment of learning, which is like the traditional type of assessment. It's usually kind of end of program type thing, you know, like final exam, those kinds of things, the sorts of things we're kind of used to in terms of formal assessment. Um, and then lane two, which is assessment as learning, where we accept that students will or and perhaps are asked to use AI, but obviously we want them to use it in a critical and creative way so that AI is being used as a co-pilot rather than a substitute. So this is the University of Sydney two-lane approach. I mean, there are other ways of thinking about it. There may be other ways of slicing and dicing it. This is from some conference proceedings from City University in the UK. Um, so the first thing they talk about, you know, restricting access is effectively the same as lane one. Although they sort of mention it, they mention live performance. I think, you know, performance in its very broad sense is a very useful way of assessing students in the age of AI. But they also talk about two other ways of thinking about it. Setting assessment tasks that AI is not yet good at, outrunning AI. I mean, it's an interesting idea, but it's a very challenging one, and I'll come to that a little bit later. But of course, there are assessment tasks that AI can do very easily, and there are other ones where AI might have a stab at it, but not do particularly well. And I guess, you know, we are looking for things that students can do well rather than things that AI can do well. Um, but at the end of the day, we probably have to think about working with AI. So students use AI tools, and then we have to think about how we make that a positive rather than a negative thing. So there are different ways that we might think about approaching this distinction between, do we allow AI? And if we do, how do we allow AI? I'm not going to spend long on this because if you're interested in the two-lane approach, you can go to the University of Sydney website, and all of these things you can click through and you can see how they describe each of these. I just very quickly wanted to say, you know, typically lane one assessments are the things that we know, final exams, in-semester tests, in-class exams, placements, internships, supervision. All of this is kind of invigilated, face-to-face, traditional types of assessment. They also have suggestions for lane two, and these are things where AI would be included. And you might look at those and wonder a little bit. For example, quizzes. So the suggestion is that, you know, you can have a quiz where students can use AI. Of course, we do know that AI hallucinates. So part of that process would be students, you know, checking the answers that AI comes up with, for example. Written work, you know, perhaps the area where we know that AI can do a reasonable job. And so we have to think about if we want written work, how do we do that in the age of AI? But also a number of other things that, you know, might work well with AI. So, you know, application of stuff, production, creation, inquiries, investigations, discussions. These can be done effectively with the help of AI. And can also be done badly, of course, with the help of AI. So it takes some effort from our perspective to make these work. Um, I did want to play this little clip of a video from Danny Liu from the University of Sydney, because I mentioned earlier one of the ideas, we can maybe outrun AI. One of the ways in which some educators have started sort of ensuring that students know what they're talking about is interactive oral assessments. Where you assess the student, talking about their work can be very effective. I wanted to play you this example where what if you try and do these online? Quite difficult to outrun AI in this particular example. I thought you might find this interesting if you haven't seen it already.
What about live oral assessments? There are some AI tools out there that can support these, but let's have a look at a free one called Ekoot. Ekoot runs on your computer and listens to the conversation that you're having with someone over a video call. Not only that, it also uses a large language model like GPT-4o to generate suggested responses. Let's see it in action. I've asked Ben to be my examiner and ask me some questions from his field of expertise, which I have no clue about.
Thanks for coming, Denny, for your exam today in a course on rhetoric and communication. The goal today is that we can check in on your knowledge about the course concepts. So could you start by telling me how you would define classical rhetoric?
So rhetoric to me is how we persuade through communication. It involves things like understanding and using different techniques to convey messages that influence an audience. So this includes the use of ethos, pathos, and logos, as well as considering how the audience might respond to this and tailoring the message to them appropriately.
Excellent. And a major challenge we've spoken about in the course is how you adapt communication for multicultural audiences. Have you considered this at all? And do you have any research sources that might support you in this understanding?
Yeah, so it's really important in this kind of context to adapt to multicultural audiences. It involves understanding their cultural differences and how they communicate, maybe their styles, values, and also expectations. I think it's important to be culturally sensitive and aware of these non-verbal cues, which is really important when you do communication. So things like language nuances and context and those kind of things. I've looked into sources like Hofstadter, cultural dimensions theory, and also Hall's work on high context and low context cultures. And these provide valuable insights into these differences.
Wow, that was really impressive. Yeah, I can't believe it. It's those answers are at a standard that we would get in first year writing, definitely. And then when you brought in the research, I was thinking that's sort of equivalent to second year levels.
Okay, I mean, I thought you might find that interesting because if we talk about trying to outrun AI, AI can do more and more things, and that's something we probably need to bear in mind as we go forward. Okay, let's make that a bit bigger. Okay. Yeah, so there's a bunch of challenges, isn't there, with AI in assessment? I mean, the simplest problem is that if students are submitting work they didn't create themselves because they just copied and pasted it off ChatGPT, for example, then that clearly undermines learning. So that's our big challenge. There's also some other challenges, of course. So even if students are trying to use AI, properly, we know that AI can be biased. It can also reduce meaningful human interaction because instead of talking to a human, a peer or an educator, might be just talking to a machine. And we also know, of course, that there's always a digital divide question, isn't there? It can disproportionately impact students with unequal access. Another suggestion that often comes up is, well, AI can, make a product now. It can produce a picture, it can produce an essay, it can produce all sorts of things. So should we be, focusing on the process? I mean, I think there's some value in this, but the danger is, I think, that we'll just end up with more work. So some people suggest, you can get the students to give you a list of all the prompts they used and what they got, and then how they modified that and what the next prompt was. And I mean, then we'll end up spending all our time marking. I really don't want to go down that path. And there's another aspect to this as well, which is that, yes, the process is important, but what if the product's no good? We have to keep an eye on the product as well. So I think the process is important, but we have to be careful about how we interpret that. And then the other thing that comes up is some people are trying to police the use of AI. But the problem is that there are no tools that can really do that properly, and it's very unlikely there ever will be. And they can also disadvantage students if we believe them when they're wrong. I just want to pick that last one up with a couple more elements of the discussion, really. So, as far as AI detectors go, reliable detection of AI writing is almost impossible. Here at Academy EX, we've been using Turnitin for several years. We try and use it in a sort of constructive way, so the students get to use it multiple times. They can put their work through, and if it, comes up with a thing that suggests they haven't sort of cited things very well, and it comes up with a plagiarism score, they can do something about it. Or if you're familiar with Turnitin, you'll know that there's also an AI detector built into it. But of course, it may be occasionally correct, but it also generates false positives and false negatives, as all of these detectors do. And there's some evidence that those false positives can disproportionately affect non-native English speakers as well. So, there's a sort of a bias built into the way they work. And they only know about style, and they don't look at content. So the only thing they can do is analyze style. And now there's an increasing number of tools that can change the style of something that's been written by AI, so it's less AI-like. And students know this. There's people on TikTok all over the place explaining how to use these tools to cheat, basically, or to hide that they've used AI. So the whole detector thing is largely useless. I mean, we can use them, I think, to support discussions, but that's about as far as it goes. And even Turnitin kind of acknowledged that in their own documentation. So in their guide to approaching AI-generated text, they give 11 strategies, and most of them are not about using a tool to try and detect things. It's things like motivating students with tasks worth doing, focusing on critical thinking, and so on. So even if you have an AI detector, it can just be a very small component of your overall strategy. I mean, maybe one of the valuable roles of these things is to highlight a poorly designed assessment. So if you're running around trying to use a detector, you might take a step back and go, well, maybe this assessment is kind of, no longer valid, and I've got to think about doing it in a different way. Okay, so there's all this stuff that we have to try and deal with as educators. And I was sort of wanting to come up with a little bit of a metaphor for how I think we should try to approach this. And I thought, well, the Wayfinding Leadership book and also the Wayfinding website I've quoted here is an interesting way of thinking about how we navigate a problematic ocean. So the idea is that, rather than trying to outrun AI, constantly trying to run away from it and come up with some way of getting out of its way, maybe we just stop, we sit still, and we listen and we read the signals from the environment so that we can kind of think about what's really going on. And then maybe the destination will come to us as the navigator. So that's kind of the metaphor I wanted to take in terms of let's not try and run away from AI. Let's try and see what we can read from the environment. What should we understand about this? And does that help us move forward? And I think one of the key things I kind of remind us of, really, I'm sure we all know this, that traditional assessment isn't perfect. It's not as if we had this wonderful assessment process and then AI came along and broke it. We all know that assessment has always been problematic, as it says in this article. It can be burdensome for educators, all of that marking of exam sheets and things, provides discrete snapshots of learning. It's not adaptable, it doesn't assess modern skills, and so on and so forth. There's lots of issues with many of the ways that we've traditionally assessed. So that's something that we should probably acknowledge, that it's not AI's fault that assessment is problematic. It was already problematic. And cheating's been around for a long time. I didn't arrive with AI. We know that students have cheated, historically. Um, I kept this image from one I did a while ago just because I thought it was quite entertaining. when I was using DALL-E 3. As you probably know, DALL-E 3 on ChatGPT has now been replaced by GPT's own model, which makes rather more, it is better at text, but the pictures are not as entertaining. So I thought I'd keep this one. Yeah, a prompt, a student paying someone else to write an essay for them. As we know, these essay mills have been around for a very long time. So it's not as if AI is suddenly there. In fact, some literature suggests that the level of cheating with AI is no higher than it was before. It's just that we're more aware of it maybe than we were when students were copying each other or getting someone else to do the work for them. So that's another thing to bear in mind. And this is an interesting quote, I think. You know, why do students cheat? So one thing is they just might be struggling and can't get the help they need. Maybe they've got too much to do, too much homework. Maybe the assignments just feel like they're just pointless busy work, so that they don't see any value in doing them. And a lot of students who cheat one way or another, no, they know it's wrong, but they're under pressure. So it's often just a symptom of a deeper systemic problem. You know, we get some students just handing in AI written work from time to time at Academy EX, and when we kind of, you know, discuss it with them, it's usually because they panicked. You know, they were under pressure, they hadn't done it, and they just, you know, they just panicked and handed something in that was written with AI. And it's not as if we tell students they can't use AI. I mean, we're happy to allow them to use it as part of their process, but of course, you know, if it's just copied and pasted, it is fairly obvious. You know, even without an AI detector, it doesn't really address the question, and it's all bland and waffly. But you know, we need to look at, well, what's the systemic problem going on behind this? Is there something wrong with the way that we're thinking about assessment? I wanted to play a fairly short clip of this video. This is from the University of New South Wales. And I think it kind of captures the idea that we need to stop worrying about cheating so much and focus more on what we can do about student learning. So I'll just play you this short clip.
As an educator, some of the main challenges that generative AI presents us with is the stark fact that the assessment tasks that we get students to do, which usually involves them generating some kind of an artifact, whether it be an essay or an exam paper or a performance, a lot of those artifacts can now be produced to at least a good enough standard by a robot. So we have to accept that at least some of how we've currently designed assessment and feedback to work is now at risk. So we need to, the challenge really for a teacher, for an educator, is to think, okay, now what? What do I do? How do I move beyond this into a place where I can be more confident that I'm measuring genuine student learning? The other side of the coin, of course, is that we have to accept that these tools exist. They're in the world of work. They're actually going to start to infiltrate the very tools that most of us use in our professional daily lives. So the whole question that we've got to think about is, on the one hand, we need to be confident that we've seen that the student can do the work themselves. But on the other side of that coin, we have to ask ourselves, well, in a world where ChatGPT exists, what is the work? That's the challenge. The key focus that a teacher has to keep is on the learning. We should be designing assessment for an as learning. In other words, we should be designing it for the students who would never cheat. But on the other side of things, in some ways we have to kind of give up on being too distracted by how students are cheating. We need to sort of sweep away the technologies, the techniques, the strategies they're using to cheat, and focus in instead on learning. So the way I'm describing it to people at the moment is to say, stop trying to find evidence that proves that cheating has occurred, and instead try to find evidence that learning has occurred. That allows you to keep your teacher hat on and also reframes the relationship you've got with your students and the process we're all going through when we do assessment, feedback, grading, marking. We need to turn our attention to the really important proposition of how do we empty the value of cheating from our courses and focus instead on assuring learning.
Okay. So I think that's quite a nice video in terms of, you know, it's a nice aspiration, isn't it? Let's stop worrying about the cheating and focus on how can we design assessments that are all about the learning. I think if we want to use AI positively in assessment, there's kind of three big paths to follow kind of simultaneously. So on the right-hand side, we want authentic assessment in the sense we want to measure learning, whether or not AI is being used. How do we focus on learning? The second one is, you know, how do we engage students cognitively so that AI is being used to enhance learning and their critical thinking, so it becomes a positive partner. And then the third thing, and I think this is very important, is the transparency and honesty, because we find so many students are, you know, guiltily hiding their AI use, even though, you know, we've discussed that AI is an acceptable tool to use, you know, in the right way, but we need to be a lot more helpful about that, I think. We need to give students much more information about what does it mean to be a transparent and honest user of AI. I just wanted to ask you to do one more Slido before I start moving into the last part of my presentation, which is I'm interested to know, we've discussed a lot about AI in assessment. What role does AI currently play in your assessments for you or your students? And again, good, bad, or indifferent, whatever you'd like to share, I'd be interested to see. So this is our last Slido of the session. I'll give you a couple of minutes. This is another sort of long answer one rather than a word cloud. So you can write whatever you like. Yes, we don't always know. That's very true. Or sometimes we know, but we don't have hard evidence that we know. Cool. Yes, I think, you know, there are elements of sort of ethical layers to using it for grading, but I think if we use it for grading support, it can be very useful because we know that it's good at mapping things together. It's good at comparing work to a rubric. It's good at comparing how well you filled a form into the questions the form asks. That is an area where it's pretty good and less likely to hallucinate. Okay. Yeah, and it may be that, you know, you don't have any knowledge of AI specifically being used. You're not directly using it. That's fair enough. I'm sure there's many people who are not really knowing or engaging with it yet for various reasons. Yeah. I mean, that thing about needs to be checked. Well, I'll give a couple of examples in a moment that might be helpful. But I'm not saying I've got any magic bullets. Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? Like an AI detector isn't particularly reliable, but if students don't work hard at hiding their AI writing, it is kind of blindingly obvious, isn't it? It's just such boring writing. Yeah, yeah, that's right. AI needs to be in a context where you can judge it, doesn't it? Rather than I don't know whether that's true or not, and I've got no way of knowing. Yeah, another one about rubrics. So yeah, definitely rubrics seems to be a popular option. I'll just wait a little bit longer and then I'll start moving towards the end of the session. I'm going to try and give one or two perhaps positive suggestions before we wrap up. That's a nice long answer. Yeah, code's an interesting one, isn't it? Because with code, I mean, professionals are using, you know, GitHub Copilot and Claude and so on to do software development. Um, And I did a similar session last night for the Technology Educators New Zealand. So it was a different focus, and I was talking about things like, coding and some other aspects of technology. And, we have to move away from marking code, really. And as you say, getting them to explain code, but maybe also focusing on the sort of design and analysis and architecture side of it. Yeah, alignment with learning outcomes, that constructive alignment is great at that sort of thing. Cool. I'm going to move on. Thank you for those many suggestions. Gives me a nice idea about the sorts of things you're doing. I very briefly wanted to mention traffic lights because a lot of people a year or so ago, starting maybe a couple of years now, started coming out with all these different traffic lights about, okay, if students are going to use AI, we can provide all of these things that gives them guidance about what they're supposed to do by giving them traffic lights, but it doesn't really work. And I just got one quote here that I think captures it really. This is from actually a kind of college magazine in the US, but it was just students talking about it. They had a traffic light system, but as it says, you don't know, you don't really know what you're doing when it's not red or green. What are you supposed to do when it's yellow or orange or any of those ones in the middle? And what are the guidelines? And what does it mean if it's yellow but you can't use ChatGPT? And then as another student said, I don't think I've ever seen a green assignment. So if you have a traffic light, what's the point of it if you can't say what those colors actually mean, or you don't even use them? So I think there's a lot of problems with traffic lights, and I'm going to just play another little clip. This is a different Danny Liu video, but he's talking about maybe thinking about menus rather than traffic lights. I don't know if this is useful or not, but I think it's a better way of thinking about it.
So we've seen a few examples of how students might use AI as part of their assessment and not necessarily in ways that will always help them learn. The reality is that there are a whole set of different ways that AI could be used in the process of assessment. We can't limit, prevent, or detect students' use of AI in any of these ways. So there's no point really in going around saying as an assignment, this is an orange assignment where you can only use AI for brainstorming, or this is a yellow assignment where you can only use AI for editing, or this is a green assignment where you can only use AI for drafting some text. As Phil Dawson says, restrictions which are unenforceable will hurt the assessment validity. So our approach at the University of Sydney is to take a menu analogy. When you go to a restaurant, the role of the staff there is to help you to navigate the menu and to pick what is healthiest for you to eat based on your allergies, your needs, and your appetite. This menu analogy matches the reality that there are many ways that AI could be used, and it's not as simple as a traffic light system or a scale that you can slide along. When you go to a restaurant, you could eat anything on the menu, and if you eat everything on the menu, then you're going to get sick. An alternative take might be to say to students, these are all the ways that you could use AI, and we know you could use AI in all these ways. We're going to support you. We're going to say and show you how, for example, for assessment 1, maybe these are the most useful ways to use AI, and for assessment 2, these are the most helpful and healthiest ways to use AI. We've seen some examples in this video of some ways that AI can be used by students, and our role as educators is to help them understand the healthy choices and how to engage with AI productively and responsibly.
Okay, I mean, it's an interesting idea, I think, and I think it's more realistic than traffic lights, I guess.
So we've seen a few examples of how.
Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Right, I do need to start wrapping up, so I'm just going to give a couple more ideas. Flipped learning through assessment was something I read a post on Facebook by a teacher from the US, and they were actually trying to sort of avoid AI, but I kind of, when the more I thought about it, I thought some of their ideas were quite interesting. It was about kind of flipping what you do so that you assess in the classroom. And the idea was that, the students can't use AI in the classroom, but I kind of thought, well, if you did that flipping, if you don't know what students are using, when they're at home, of course they're going to use AI. So let them use AI in whatever way they want to engage with the content and learn stuff to prepare them for something that you do in the classroom. And then in the classroom, you kind of do assessment for learning, really, and you could use AI, but you're there to manage that use of AI. And so students kind of develop and demonstrate the learning that they may have acquired through using AI, but they're applying it in a face-to-face context. And I think that's a kind of really useful way of thinking about how we might do this. The other one that I thought I had another slide that I've seemed to have mislaid slightly, but that's okay. So one of the things that we might ask is, well, if we do what I was going to talk about a little bit was interactive oral assessments. So where are you, instead of getting people handing stuff in, you talk to them. And if you're doing it face to face, again, that's fairly bulletproof. But the question is, doesn't it all take a lot of time? Some people think, well, if I've got 100 students and I've got to, interactively assess them orally, won't that be impossible? But University of Auckland use these a lot now, and they reckon that once you kind of got into the groove, it doesn't really take any longer because you're doing the grading while you're talking to the students. So it all kind of comes out more or less even according to them. Now the teacher was talking about kind of flipping the assessment. She said a lot of her colleagues were saying you're spending far too much time assessing. You're like assessing them all day long. And her answer was, yeah, but they're also learning. So they're learning through the assessment. So I think there's ways that we can kind of rethink how the assessment and the learning kind of happening more at the same time, rather than assessment being a discrete snapshot of what we think they may or may not have learned through an artifact. Just a couple of thoughts. I wanted to wrap up by just saying that AI literacy is something that I and some colleagues have been working on for a while, and we developed this framework called the SAIL framework. And it's basically a kind of a set of competencies that work at different levels. The reason I wanted to talk about it was that if we want students, I talked earlier about the fact that if we want to be transparent with students, we need to be able to kind of explain what we want. It's all very well us saying, oh, here's a traffic light, use AI well, properly. Well, what does that mean? We have to be very, very careful about that. And I think one way that we can perhaps explain those things is by, when we give students assessment, that we also talk about and explain and possibly work through what the AI literacies are that are required to do that task, so the students actually know what it is we want. So there's no confusion about what is or isn't appropriate use of AI. And I just wanted to share a couple of sort of indicative examples with you. I'm not sure how useful they are. It's just a bit of a thought exercise, really. I was just thinking, like, if you take a very general example, so in any assessment where the students might use AI, what you could do is you could include in that process some work around the AI literacies. So, for example, there's three domains inside the model. So you've got concepts, application and skills, and digital citizenship. And in each of these, I've just kind of chosen an indicative aspect under one of the categories. So, for example, under concepts, in any kind of AI-based application, you could identify how the AI is being used in that context. So thinking about what the role of AI is in the assessment that they're doing. In the cognitive skills, evaluate when the use or non-use of it's suitable. So having that discussion around, well, where is it better not to be using AI in this particular task? And where is it better to be using AI as a hopefully as a co-pilot? And then risks and mitigations, demonstrate responsible and safe behaviors toward AI and the threats it poses through misuse. So just kind of, talking through that idea about what happens to your learning if you only use AI? What are the consequences going to be for you in your own development and your own future, and what it is that you want to learn? So those kinds of conversations. I mean, that's very, very broad. And of course, other tasks might be a bit more specific. And I just wanted to sort of suggest something that was a bit more focused. So, I don't know much about careers education, but I put one in that space. So students might be tasked with creating images of people in specific work roles, using a range of tools, critiquing the outputs, trying to address issues using prompt engineering. So, for example, it might be explain how users can interact with AI systems, including natural language. If you're trying to overcome, for example, cultural or gender bias in images, then it's all about prompt engineering. It's about how we interact with the system. The second one, evaluating the role of data and the implications data has on the training of AI models, and sort of understanding, well, why are images sometimes biased in a particular way? What causes that? And the last one there, discuss the impact of AI on cultural diversity and ways of addressing cultural bias in AI systems. Again, thinking about, you've got all these images of people in work roles. What is it saying to us about, the nature of the society that generated that data that may in some ways not be addressing diversity in the way that we might like? I think these are things that we might consider, at least just a few general ideas. I'm pretty much there then. So I'll just do a quick conclusion. I'll then open up some questions. Then after that, I'll just give Lisa a chance to just briefly talk a little bit about some of our program offerings. So just as sum up, really, I think it's not just a challenge that we've got AI to worry about. It's also an invitation to innovate in assessment. I think it gives us a prompt, if you like, to think about how we might assess differently. And it's not just about today's technology, but it's about tomorrow's learners. All of our learners are going to go out into this AI-enabled world, and we've got to try to prepare them well for that, to use AI in constructive and transparent and constructive ways rather than negative ways. So trying to sort of come up with a vaguely AI sounding phrase. The future of assessment is AI informed, student centered, inclusive, integrated with learning, and focused on preparing learners for a rapidly changing world. ChatGPT could very easily have come up with that one. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to just stop sharing. I'll come back to that. I just wanted to open up in case there were any questions anyone wanted to ask. You can either just put your mic on, or you can put something in the chat. Either is fine. I'm sure someone's got something they would. It doesn't have to be a question. It can just be an observation or something you'd like to share.
I just wanted to say thanks, Dave. That was that was really helpful for me.
Cool. Thanks, Kingsley. Okay. All right. Well, we can leave it there if you like, and I'll just if you don't mind, if you could just hang around for a moment, just while Lisa just talks a little bit through. I know that some of you know what we do very well, but in case you're not familiar with our programs, there might be something here of interest. Lisa, over to you.
Kia ora. Thank you for joining us tonight. I just wanted to share with you really briefly about a couple of programs that may be of interest to you. We do a postgrad certificate in digital and collaborative learning. Sorry, I should have started with Academy EX, the Mind Lab, is really, really non-traditional and really practical. We've been around since 2013, and the postgrad certificate in digital and collaborative learning, is contemporary skills, but just as much changing the pedagogy of teaching to student-led, resilience, failure, collaboration. Really, really powerful stuff. We get whole schools doing the program, principals, teachers, SENCOs, RTLBs, librarians, mainly focused on primary and secondary. That said, we have ECE, tertiary, university, corporate, and in fact, health doctors teaching other doctors around the world. That program is 32 weeks with one session live online a week of 90 minutes. This intake coming up in August. The session, I believe, is Wednesdays 6:30 to 8. That program can be done completely live online if you like. There are couple of block sessions that can be done face-to-face or online. We have a limited number of 50% scholarships available for that program. The postgrad is the first third of our Master of Contemporary Education, and the main focus of that Master's is a change project of your choice. So it could be your work focus, your passion, it's up to you. We'll walk alongside you to get that thing done. So the postgrad can be the first part. The second part is looking at what might be your project, the research, ethics, and more. And part 3 is you implementing that change. So the ripples of benefit to your school, your students, your community go far and wide. We have an intake coming up in July for those who have done the postgrad, so starting at part 2. And then we have an intake in August for those starting at part 1 for the whole journey, the 3 parts. We have a limited number of scholarships available, 50% scholarships available for those. The scholarships are Tangata Whenua, Pacific Arco, Taipeki over 60, and Impact for those with the intent to do good for the world, the people. We see educators as servant leaders, so you're definitely eligible for at least one of those scholarships. We also have a range of ideas we can help you with for funding your study. We have templates to approach your work, any groups or associations you're part of. The study link, and we have an early bird discount. To apply for a program, you apply to enroll on our website, but also equally at the same time you apply for a scholarship. The scholarship application takes you through the process. There's a limited number of text available, or you can do a video to apply. In your scholarship application, we just want you to be you and talk about your why and what you hope to achieve from doing the program. You'll see my contact details. I'm
There we go.
only I'm only a phone call and email away. I'm here to help. So please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. I'll just wrap us up with our closing karakia tonight, and then we'll send you on your way for the rest of your evening. Ka whakairia te tapu kia wate aitiara, kia turuki whakata ai, kia turuki whakata ai, haumie huie tai kie. Thanks for coming tonight. I hope you got something out of the session, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Ka kite.
Thanks, team. Awesome.